Hi everybody, welcome to today's special edition Substack video here from the GLOBSEC Summit in Prague, Czechia. My name is Dave Keating from the Gulfstream Blues Substack, and I'm joined by
Julien from the French Dispatch. We are very happy to be bringing you a special video this week from Prague.
Yeah, we usually do these Substack Lives remotely. I think this is the first one we've done in the same physical space.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is very cool. We both happen to be here. We both were moderating panels here at GLOBSEC, and we have a lot of thoughts about what we've heard here today, but maybe first we should explain what this summit is. You could kind of describe it as a combination of the MSC, the Munich Security Conference, and Davos, the World Economic Forum, because it deals with both economic issues and security issues, but with a special focus on Central and Eastern Europe. It was sometimes in Slovakia, sometimes in Czechia, but it's always having Central Europe as its focus. And so it's dealing with a lot of the same themes as both the MSC and the WEF, but with a particular focus.
Yeah, and it's one of these really important events when it comes to actually discussing the policies and the structures in Europe, because it doesn't just bring politicians and generals and these high-level speakers, it also brings academics, it brings the news experts who cover this on a daily basis, and it creates a space for discussion that helps us to actually come to some kind of idea of how we think, what's actually happening around us, and whether or not we're actually capable of coming out of the mess we're currently in. And we have strong opinions on this topic, as we've been discussing recently.
As readers of both our Substacks will know. I mean, this is coming at obviously a very pivotal point, because it's following immediately the announcement of the troop withdrawals from Poland, from Germany, and Donald Trump's new NATO threats, because European countries are not coming to bail him out of the Iran war. And that's, I think, what's given this summit a particular focus, so much so that Politico decided to do a live blog on it both days, which I was surprised by, but I guess it makes sense, because we have a lot of politicians here, a lot of military leaders in particular. We've got people walking around in their military uniforms all over the place. And what we were talking about before is we are in day two, about halfway through day two, so we've already been here at the summit for 2 days. And what we're seeing is this real disconnect between what the politicians are saying and what everyone else is saying, because you have a lot of head in the sand attitude still being displayed on these panels, where you're getting people saying the Transatlantic alliance is still strong, the West is still friendly relations, but then in reality you've got everyone else sitting in the audience, sitting there very skeptical and not really believing that.
Yeah, and we've both sat into quite a few panels on top of the ones that we've moderated, and we're coming to a point where we're realizing that a lot of the politicians who are actually engaging in these discussions are either not entirely aware of how bad things are, which would be very surprising, or they're intentionally obfuscating the problems.
Yeah, I think it's the latter.
Yeah, and we're hearing discussions, we're speaking with a lot of the participants, we're listening to what's actually being said around us. And there are a lot of people who are shocked about the fact that so many people are supporting the EU's relationship with the US. They seem to be intent on maintaining this sort of subjugation of the EU to the US, and lots of people are saying that the EU should just suck it up and work with the US regardless of what's happening. Similar to what many of you may have seen recently with Rutte's speech in Sweden, for example, today, where he said that maybe it's the European Union's fault that Donald Trump isn't very happy and he's pulling troops out and playing games with the positioning. And while I'll get on to some discussions that we've heard about potential solutions to this in terms of the institutions and restructuring of the Union, it's really, I mean, we've both talked about this already, but we're both really shocked about the fact that people simply seem to think that everything's fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly frustrating, because you're getting two contradictory messages. So the founder of GLOBSEC gave the introductory speech at the beginning of the day yesterday, and he said, the world has changed and we are not going back to the previous world. But then we get all these messages from politicians which are clearly under the delusion that we will go back to the previous world, that the transatlantic alliance still exists and the West still exists as we've known it before. And so, you're getting on the kind of high level, everyone's like, yes, everything's changed. And they'll say that everyone here, if you stop someone in the middle of the hallway and say, do you think we're in a fundamentally new era? No one's going to say, absolutely not. Nothing's happened. Everything's the same. No. They'll say, yes, we're in a new era. But the transatlantic alliance remains the same. The Americans are still our friends. NATO is still the bedrock of European security. So they can't bring themselves to actually talk about the specifics of what that means. And I have two concrete examples here. One was a session we were both at yesterday where Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Secretary General of NATO, was interviewing Mark Esper, the former U.S. Defense Secretary. And Rasmussen asked him very bluntly, can we still trust the United States? And Esper responded that he understood why he was asking the question, and it's a good question, but yes, Europe can still trust the United States. And then he said if Russia were to attack, he was confident that the U.S. would live up to its commitments. And then there was this long, painful silence. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, it felt like 20 seconds. I'm not sure how long it was, but the whole room just went silent. And then Rasmussen said very dryly, that's good to hear. Yeah. And there was some nervous laughter. And then Mark Esper said, there's no applause. Where's the person clapping? He was referring to one person who had clapped earlier in the interview. Then I think there was like a couple little smattering of clapping, and Esper said, I guess that's the Americans clapping. And that really, I think, goes to the fundamental thing that's happening here, is that we've got these politicians on the panels saying that everything, not saying that everything's fine, but saying that there is still a West and there is still a transatlantic relationship. And in the audience, nobody's buying it because they have eyes and ears. They can see what's happening. And, who could possibly be reassured sitting in that audience, hearing Mark Esper, who is the former defense secretary, not the current one, saying, yes, you can still trust the United States and the U.S. would still defend Europe in the event of a Russian invasion, because people sitting on those seats simply do not believe it anymore.
Yeah, and it's, to be fair, to Rasmussen's credit, he did make a few very strong points and very important points about the need to start refocusing on what Europe can do, introducing this European pillar to NATO. And while he made the clarification that, it wouldn't involve duplication, on that point, I at least chose to be a bit more optimistic when it came to that statement, in that he mostly meant not duplicating structures we already have, but really transposing them to a European dynamic. The big problem I have, however, is that there is still, and taking up on your point from that panel as well, there is still the sense that politicians like Rasmussen still believe that we can rely on the United States for leadership. One of the big points he made, which I think you probably remember, was that the US should continue to be the leader when it comes to the NATO alliance. And again, there was also a sense that people started looking at each other like, are we really doing this again? Like, we've just talked about how Donald Trump has upended the world order, how he's trashing the economy for reasons that literally nobody can understand. And that on top of this, he's really expected to somehow come and save us if Putin, who Rasmussen said Trump has an unhealthy relationship with, and an unhealthy obsession with, comes and attacks us. And I think this comes to this weird contradiction where people seem to say one thing on one side and then contradict it on the other by assuming that we're somehow still under the umbrella of the American government.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true that it was good to hear a former U.S. Defense Secretary say that we need a European pillar, because that is a phrase that used to be banned by the U.S. government, essentially. In a story that I retell in my book, The Owned Continent, available wherever fine books are sold, I tell the story of how the U.S. Defense Secretary in 1999 at a NATO summit said, quote, there will be no EU caucus of NATO. He was fighting against efforts to insert European defense into the EU constitution, which was being drafted at the time. And the British cheered this when the US Defense Secretary said it, because they were angry at the French for trying to introduce this European pillar into NATO. So this European pillar thing has been something that the United States has been fighting for decades. So it's good to hear that he wants a European pillar. But a European pillar cannot simply be that the Europeans spend more. A European pillar means European command and control. It means that Europe would be able to act independently of NATO, so that you have an alliance with NATO, you have an alliance with the United States within NATO, but that Europe would be capable of acting without NATO, and that can't be done simply with spending. And that's what I didn't hear from that conversation. Yeah. Rasmussen also talked to Politico downstairs at the speakeasy thing that they have, and again, he's saying kind of the right things. He's saying that there needs to be an establishment of European defense, but I think it needs to be made really, really explicit that this cannot be done through the existing NATO structure where there is an American Supreme Allied Commander, because as long as there is, the NATO is simply a American protectorate over Europe, and Europeans are dependent on the Americans for organizing the defense, because the Europeans can spend as much as they want. If they're not organizing the defense themselves, they're going to be helpless if the US says, no thanks, we don't want to participate in this war and defend you from Russian invasion.
Yeah, and it kind of comes back to this point that we always keep bringing up on both our panel, on our Substacks, is that quite simply there was a solution to this that was proposed something like 9 years ago now, which was the plan by Emmanuel Macron to develop more European coordination to go towards a European army. And then what happened? The transatlanticists ended up killing the idea repeatedly until it became too late to implement when we really needed it.
On both sides of the Atlantic.
On both sides of the Atlantic, because it didn't suit their wish to be closer to the US and to be more active with working with the US.
Because the fear we always heard is no duplication with NATO.
Yeah.
We can't have any duplication with NATO. And Esper used those exact words yesterday.
Yeah.
But we can't have duplication with NATO. But that has always been used as a block against European defense. So I was disheartened to hear him use that again. The second example I saw of this was actually just earlier today. It was a panel specifically about the deterioration of the EU-US relationship and essentially whether the West still exists, whether the West will destroy itself, I think was the actual words used in the title of the panel. And we have Philip Rieker on that panel, the former Assistant Secretary of State for the US in the previous administration, and he was saying that he thinks that the NATO summit in July in Ankara was going to show how strong the Atlantic Alliance is. It's going to show that the relations are very strong, and he was saying that he thinks that Europe should help in the current Iran war because the U.S. protects Europe, and so Europe essentially owes something to the U.S. in return, and so therefore they should take up Donald Trump's call to defend the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I actually asked him, do you really think that that's in line with public opinion to have the U.S., the way I put it in my question, to have the U.S. join, to have Europe join the U.S. war on Iran? And he insisted, no, I didn't say that. But sorry, if you're saying that the Europeans should go in a aggressive mission in the Strait of Hormuz to stop Iran from disrupting traffic, you've just joined the Iran war. Congratulations.
Yeah,
that is what he was asking for. Now, in answering my question, he said, look, Europe needs to have a transactional approach because they're dealing with a transactional president. And so Europe should, if I read him correctly, he's saying basically Europe should ask for a commitment to defend Ukraine, a commitment to maintain American defense over Europe in exchange for helping Trump out right now in the Strait of Hormuz. But as we've talked about before in a previous Substack Live, I gamed this out in one of my Substack posts, like how exactly would this work? Yeah. And you end up with the inevitable conclusion that there is no promise that the EU could extract from Donald Trump on Ukraine, on tariffs, on general European defense that Europe could trust, because Mark Esper is wrong. Europe cannot trust the United States. And so any guarantee from Trump that he's going to support Ukraine or is no longer going to make tariff threats, and so, okay, the Europeans go in and risk European lives, risk an exploding war because they think they're getting this deal with Donald Trump, I just think that would be incredibly stupid.
And the worst part, and to be clear, this guy's a Democrat, if I'm not wrong, yes. So it's even more comical.
Well, I'm not sure he has a political party affiliation, but he was under a Democratic administration.
He worked under a Democratic administration, Joe Biden's, if I'm not wrong. And while he's saying these things, there are news articles being published about how Mark Rutte is announcing to Europeans that this summit in July is where Donald Trump is going to tell them how aggrieved he is about their behavior. So it's become this really sick humiliation ritual that makes absolutely no sense. And we're seeing this across the board here at GLOBSEC this year. We're seeing this across all the discussions we're seeing. And to be honest, people are coming up with solutions to this, but they're not necessarily in the military domain or the political domain. They're almost entirely focusing on what the EU should do to actually pull away from the US and be more independent on its own without destroying its trade relationship with the US and also with China. Yeah. So I was moderating a panel last night discussing whether Europe was fit for purpose in terms of the institutions, the political culture, the economy, and I had several very, very high-level speakers like Benjamin Haddad, the Minister Delegate for European Affairs in the French government, Mark Leonard, who's the Director of the ECFR, and the High Representative for Human Rights from the EES, amongst other people. And overall, pretty much everybody agreed that there was a big issue, helped by the fact that this was just Europeans talking to Europeans for the most part. And that in reality, what we needed to do was we almost needed to just have a look at the institutions as they are and start restructuring the way we do things and augmenting our capabilities where we need to augment them in terms of industrial capacity, so we can start producing what we need to do, both in civilian economies and military economies. Looking at how to restructure our way of engaging in diplomatic endeavors from a European and less of a nation state point of view. And on top of that as well, and this was potentially the funniest part of the actual panel, is that right at the end, one of my panelists, Tomáš, I can never remember his second name, and I cannot pronounce it either, so I'm not going to try, but a Czech politician from the EPP.
Member of the European Parliament.
Yeah, member of the European Parliament. His grand solution was actually that we have too many chefs in the kitchen when it comes to the European Union, and that we should actually start cutting down some of the institutions and reinforcing the ones where we actually need more firepower. Particularly the
something I think we both agree with, actually.
Yes.
But not... Depends on in what spirit you were approaching this exercise, I would say.
Because he had a very interesting point of view, and I had to
His tone sounded very aggressive, so I was thinking, I wouldn't trust this guy to do it. But
and I also
he's not entirely wrong.
Yeah. But really talking about the fact that we have too many institutions that don't necessarily do the work that is actually useful to the EU in terms of the really raw geopolitical aspect of things. And honestly, this is a sense that I'm getting from everybody in general. Like, maybe not as aggressively borderline Eurosceptic as this speaker was, and I'll add the name to the Substack post, but very much the spirit of it, that we need to look at whether what we've got now in the European Union, created at a time of peace and security and prosperity, is really fit for purpose, and if we don't need to create structures that we saw states across the world build in times of crisis. France under Richelieu, the United States under the Founding Fathers, the German states after the fall of Nazi Germany, and potentially even Weimar if you want to go that far back, right? Because we need to avoid becoming complacent in general. We need to actually make sure that we're doing what we need to do and that we're actually trying to make an effort to make the right choices, which, as a lot of my speakers said, aren't necessarily the easy ones.
I mean, it was another point that I was going to ask a question to Mark Leonard, the head of the European Council on Foreign Relations, who was also on the panel. I ended up asking a different question instead, but Mark, who's someone I really admire, I love his podcast, The World in 30 Minutes. You guys should check it out. But he said that we shouldn't get so caught up on institutional reform and trying to think of how we fix the EU and change how the EU works, because there's lots of things we can do right now without institutional reform. And I agree with him. There are lots of things we can do. But the problem is we can't avoid the question of institutional reform. So he's saying basically, everyone's afraid of treaty change because of what happened with the Lisbon Treaty, with the EU Constitution turned into the Lisbon Treaty, and it was such a mess and it took so long. And so people are just like, nope, we can't open up the treaty change things because it opens up a vehicle for the far right to attack us and blah, blah, blah. And Leonard was basically echoing that. Let's stop getting into this navel-gazing institutional change. But then later he was praising this idea from Friedrich Merz that he's come out with for basically associate membership for Ukraine. Yeah. So instead of giving them full EU membership, which will not happen anytime soon, anyone promising that is lying or misinformed. Instead, you could give them this associate membership in which they don't have voting power, but they sit in meetings. They have a commissioner. That's the last thing we need, by the way, another commissioner. But don't get me started on that. That's why we need institutional reform. But anyway, but I was thinking as he was saying that, he's saying that's a great idea. Well, Mark, guess what you need for that? Treaty change.
Yeah.
So as soon as it's great to talk about in theory, we don't need treaty change and we don't need institutional reform. But as soon as you start talking seriously about what needs to change, within a few minutes, you are at an inflection point where you need treaty change.
Yeah.
So, and I know it takes a long time. That's why we need to start now. That's why we need to start yesterday. Every day that we waste before we start this process of a constitutional convention toward treaty change, I mean, you could argue that we've already had a constitutional convention with the Conference on the Future of Europe. No matter, even if it was poorly done or not well run, use it as a basis. But we do need treaty change. I completely, as I write in my book, I'm completely against this idea that we can somehow save the European Union without treaty change. It's not possible. And so I do, as much as I respect Mark, I really disagree with him on that.
And I mean, it comes down to the fundamental issue where a lot of us forget that in lots of the member states of the European Union, when they need to change the constitution, there is a legal framework to do that goes through their sovereign parliaments.
Right.
And the problem that we have right now is that we have several roadblocks to actually being able to start building up this European constitution, changing the treaties, which is the unanimity requirement for this act. Once we have maybe one treaty change, and we could do this in a very simple way where we just change the treaties so that the council can vote in a majority sense across all borders. We maybe give a bit more power, confirmatory power, to the parliament, or give the parliament a way to propose treaty changes based on some kind of article in the TFEU or what have you. It can be easily done, and at that point it's no longer an issue. At that point it's basically a state of being able to develop what the European Union could be. And what a lot of federalists like myself, and you're a federalist too, to be fair, we would be very happy with, and we would actually enjoy this. And I think according to the polling that I'm seeing, according to the polling that we see from various organizations, young people up to the age of 35 overwhelmingly support, to be honest. And we were talking about this earlier over breakfast, I think it was actually, where we were discussing the fact that there is a generational gap between how people view these things. Like, I like Mark Leonard. He does great work. He helped set up a lot of the things that we want to do here. But he still, I feel, is basing a lot of his work or a lot of his thoughts on this topic on a mentality that comes from an age that doesn't exist anymore. And this is something that is very much changing for many people, because I'm sure that if we were in the same generation as Mark, I was maybe speaking for me, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'm closer to Mark's generation.
But for me, that's not how I think about this, because I've always grown up in the Europe. Sorry, Dave, I didn't want to call you old. But yeah. But in general, like for me, I don't see that as an issue, because I've always grown up in the European Union, and I've seen Lisbon happen. I've seen changes. I saw the coronavirus. I saw the financial crisis. I saw all of the stopgap measures that were put in place that should have required treaty change. They should have required some big legislative instrument, and they went through very easily, and they made the European Union stronger.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this morning, that in the context of, as I've been doing readings from my book, I've been doing it to half the political groups of the parliament, from the far left to the center right, and the reaction has always been the same. The old people don't like what I'm saying, and the young people agree with me. And so I realized it's not really a partisan divide that we're talking about here. It's a generational divide, that people under, let's say, 35, 40 feel really different about what the EU can be, the potential for a united EU, and they also feel very differently about the United States. Older people are much more attached, older Europeans are much more attached to the United States than younger Europeans. Also, on the treaty change point, look, here's what I think we should do. We should develop a plan A and a plan B that goes along with Mario Draghi's suggestion for a two-speed Europe. So you devise treaty change that says, okay, we're going to assume that we can do this as an EU of 27. That everyone's going to approve this. Here, we'll get rid of unanimity in the council, maybe get rid of the EESC and the Committee of the Regions, as that MEP was suggesting. Do all the things that we need to do in order to make the EU an independent, strong, and sovereign power in the world. And then if there's some some countries that say no, okay, we do need unanimity to make the EU, to have this be a real EU treaty change. Then we go to plan B, two-speed Europe. So then we say, okay, we're going to do this as enhanced cooperation with an inner core of countries, and those outer core countries can sit it out. They will remain under the same framework that existed before this change, and we in the center, or whatever countries want to sign up, will go forward. And I guarantee you, every time there has been enhanced cooperation in the history of the European Union, the countries that didn't participate eventually give in and they join. It happened with the European patent. This is a famous example where they wanted to establish this single European patent as part of the European Patent Office, and the languages were going to be English, French, and German. The Italians and the Spanish were mad because they wanted their languages included in every patent. They said, no, it's too many languages. Okay, you can just sit this one out. Then you guys will just not be part of this European patent. They did it as enhanced cooperation. What ended up happening? Of course, the French and Italians joined quietly. This is what always happens because they don't want to be left out, right? And so either way, I mean, maybe they don't join, but then that's fine. But we have to move forward with this treaty change. And if the thinking is that we're not going to be able to get this approved by 27 national parliaments, some of which may require national referendums, certainly Ireland, then we need to move forward with those countries that will approve it.
But I think that's already happening to some extent, actually. So for the readers of the French Dispatch, I wrote an article on the E6 meeting recently, and the fact that it's building towards something like this, which is thankfully happening. It's not certain if it's going to happen yet, but they're working on doing this, which is a two-speed federalizing Europe in all but name, in order to shore up the problems when it comes to make a few examples, the stock markets, a proper European stock market that's actually functioning and able to compete, the customs union being completed, capital market union as well. And we're seeing this happening, and it's good, but the problem is, and I think you agree with me on this, is that a lot of the parties involved, so right now we only have 6 countries who are really doing it, and it's France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland,
Netherlands, but not Belgium, right?
I think it's Romania even.
Oh, okay.
I can't remember. I can't remember the 6. I'll put it in the article. But what we're seeing is that even in these people who share very like-minded views and who are very keen on actually working together on this, they still have to go through a lot of discussions to make this work. And they've already had 2 negotiating rounds, 3 negotiating rounds, I think. There's a 3rd or a 4th coming up sometime in July, I believe, in Berlin, or late in June. And the reality is that even for the countries that agree with each other, it's very difficult to come to an agreement on this because there is always going to be a risk of something going wrong in one of these countries. To say the loud part, the quiet part loudly, that sounded better in French in my head. But sure. But say the quiet part loudly, like next year we have the French elections for the presidency. Same year we have the Bundestag elections in Germany. I think Spain has elections, Poland has parliamentary elections, Italy has elections. So you've got the majority of the big members of the E6 who are facing elections that may overturn the current political paradigm and kill the E6 before it's even gone anywhere. And this is a big issue when you're doing these kind of federalist initiatives, and it's something that, to be fair, we should be focusing on a bit more in educating the public and also trying to plan ahead of time. Because these are, in no small part, one of the reasons why a lot of these politicians do, admittedly, get a bit squeamish with these kind of topics. Especially when you have people like Morawiecki, who wants to come back and maybe take another position in charge of the Law and Peace Party in Poland, for example, who gave a big speech this week, well, yesterday, where he was talking about the fact that we have too much regulation, too much bureaucracy, how we need to get less European Union, more member states, and all this kind of thing. So you see where the dynamic of these kind of topics is going.
Yeah, I think what worries me with this E6 stuff is that if you do this too piecemeal, it's going to end up being very chaotic, not really a cohesive whole, which is why I think the better idea is to actually do treaty change for a coalition of the willing in the middle, with the possibility of extending it to the whole union. I mean, I suppose you could counter that argument by saying that process takes too long. Let's move forward on this ad hoc basis with these things. We see how they're working, and then we codify them in treaty change. And then you're probably able to bring in those other countries that weren't participating in because they can see that it's working so far. I could be convinced by that argument. I mean, the main thing is we need to act quickly. So if there was an argument against my mini treaty change, it's not really mini treaty change, concentric treaty change argument.
Let's create a constitution. There's so many treaty change,
let's go full hog for the constitution this time. If the argument is that takes too long and we don't have time, I'm definitely I agree. Time is of the essence. So there's other ways to do it, but we just have to do something. And I'm not, like you say, I'm not really so convinced by what this E6 stuff is doing so far.
Yeah, but I meant it more as an example of what's being done. I mean, one thing that we could potentially do is we could make it into a constitutive body trying to figure out the way forwards. And since Emmanuel Macron is going to be looking for a job starting next May, we could give him a job there until the commission presidency opens up and then he goes to the commission, to be honest.
Sooner rather than later, hopefully.
Hopefully. But, there's ways of actually getting a political movement off the ground. We can have a follow-up to the Conference on the Future of Europe, which we both worked on, for example. And while people were squeamish in 2022, was it? 2022, right?
For what?
The COFOE.
Oh, yeah.
While people were squeamish in 2022 and tried to poo-poo the idea in general, what we could do very easily is try to do a follow-up system now that people have a bit of fire under their backsides, people have a reason to force forward, and try to find a way to actually implement many of the requests that weren't actually put forward. Notably, treaty change, more constitutive bodies and consultative bodies, more citizen engagement, for example, more funding for certain programs that actually help build this European polity with more education programs and this kind of thing, and expand the systems that we've got in place. Because I think one of the big complaints that we both had about the Conference on the Future of Europe is that a lot of it was ignored.
Almost all of it was
ignored. Yeah, most of it was ignored.
Like, who even ever heard of it to start with? But it's, it was the national governments buried that thing, and they did so purposefully.
Yeah.
And even more egregiously, we have this bunch of countries in the east and north of the EU come out with a letter chastising the citizens for what they had recommended.
How dare you have
opinions? How dare you recommend that? Because the citizens said, A, they called for treaty change, and B, they called for an end of unanimity. And these 14 countries wrote a letter being like, how dare you citizens, sit down and shut up. And that got no media attention, as is typical in Europe for
activity.
Any EU-related stuff. It's a depressing situation. But, I mean, maybe we could wrap it up by talking about what we hope comes out of this. I mean, I think I've been a bit frustrated by a lack of big picture thinking here. In fact, on the panel I moderated earlier today, there was a really good question from the audience that said, what I see is the US being really ambitious, China being really ambitious, and Europe just trying to survive. Yeah. And that really sums it up. I mean, as a continent, Europe just doesn't have ambition. It just kind of wants to sit back and accept whatever is done to it rather than trying to shape events itself. In my book, I write about some thoughts about why Europeans have this psychology of subservience. It has a lot to do with the dominance of American culture on this continent and being made to feel like you're in the outer tiers of an American empire, an American cultural empire. But it's undoubtable, and you really see it in the conversations you have at a thing like this. Even when people can understand that we're in the middle of an earthquake, the world is changing, Europe has to do something. Everybody says these things, but then when you start talking to them about what actually needs to be done, they fall back on this complete unambitious, unimaginative, short-term thinking, and it's really frustrating, and I don't know how to inject some energy into this.
Yeah, and I think I share the frustration as well, because there is something we need to do, and I think what we need to do actually is some people need to start taking the example of the founding fathers of the European Union, like the people who actually wrote all of the...
Because they were ambitious.
Because they were ambitious, and they were also selfless. And this is something that we need a bit from politicians nowadays, because we need politicians who are willing to sacrifice their entire careers to get this one thing done.
Yep.
And the worst part is, if you have a European leader like Draghi, who's already done this twice, actually, funnily enough, with his Draghi report and also with the Anything It Takes with the financial crisis. If you have someone who goes full hog, I will burn my career to make sure that we fix all of the issues in the union. We fix the problems with our economy, our industry, our structures, our institutions, everything. Rather than Ursula von der Leyen's piecemeal CDU style blah, 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 where she does nothing at all and then basically creates a few weird plans that achieve absolutely nothing, and then basically runs off into the horizon to try to become the chancellor again. We may actually get somewhere if someone actually just does something.
Yeah.
And I think this is the thing that everybody's saying here, at least outside the politicians. We need someone who's just going to do something. Which is why, funny enough, me and Dave are gonna, if there's any openings for any office, we're gonna run straight into that.
I mean, let's call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
We are living in an incredibly dangerous era for Europe because of the threats that are surrounding Europe from Russia, the United States, and China concurrently at a time of a leadership vacuum in Europe. Our leaders are cowards. They have demonstrated their cowardice over the past year, and these people cannot lead us out of this. This is the most frustrating part, that I don't even see how these people can be capable. Now, we may have a leadership change in the UK coming up. I personally think that is badly needed. I know it's going to cause a lot of chaos,
Really?
but
Okay.
I do not see how Starmer can lead the UK in a positive direction at this point. He's just, his temperament does not allow him to do so. And I would kind of go down the list with our leaders and say the same thing about all of them. But these are the leaders we have. So at the very least, people here at a summit like this need to be daring to dream big, daring to have ambition. They need to be angry, and they need to be calling on these cowards that they have for leaders to do something. Because if they don't, von der Leyen, Merz, Macron, Maloney, Starmer, they're not hearing the urgency from their citizens.
Yeah.
We know the citizens are scared right now. They're scared of what's happening, but they need to be demanding action from their leaders. They need to be angry at their leaders for not delivering them solutions to the danger that we find ourselves in.
And I agree on most of that. I think we need to do another one of these to debate the whole Starmer position, because I actually disagree with you on that point.
Interesting. Okay,
to be honest.
stay tuned. That'll
Stay
be the
tuned.
next.
We need to discuss this next time.
Maybe after he resigns.
I hope not, which is why we need to get back
right
to this.
before he resigns.
Oh, come on. But no, I agree, and we need people, and everybody listening to this, my call, and I think your call as well, is always you need to be politically active, you need to be engaging with your politicians, you need to write to your MP, your MEP, your local councillor, and start doing something. And obviously, I'm always, as a political activist myself, it's always good to actually get involved in these organizations and political parties if you have one that suits you, and get involved and actually make your voice heard. Because, let's face it, we hear a lot of things from Eurobarometer, from Pew, from Ipsos, from whatever sondage agency that exists, where people believe these things, but the problem is people only believe these things
Because they were asked.
because they were asked.
Yeah.
You need
They're
to make
not
sure
writing to their MP.
No,
They're
yeah.
not actually demanding it. This is the problem.
And so I guess my call for you guys now, this is probably your call too, is first get active, engage in the politics, engage in the discussions, and of course make sure you subscribe to our Substacks, our newsletters, because then you can actually listen to the things that we share with you and get news on what's happening, get fired up about it, and then go and bother your MP and make sure that he knows that you disagree or you agree with something,
Or
and
she.
make it happen. And she, yeah, sorry, my bad. I've been speaking to dudes all weekend so far. So.
We are at a very male-heavy
Yeah.
summit.
But it's something needs to be done, and to be typically French and optimistic, you need to make things happen. So
Yes.
let's
Hopefully
leave
we
on
can
that note.
end it on that inspiring note. Thanks
I
guys
try.
for watching and joining us here at
GLOBSEC.
GLOBSEC. We both fly back to Brussels tomorrow, so for those of you in Brussels, we'll see you there. Otherwise,
Yes.
tune into both of our Substacks for
Yes.
future articles and videos.
And thank you very much, guys. Have a great weekend, and share this, like, subscribe, make us famous.
Bye-bye.